Welcome to the Dialogues podcast, brought to you by the Center for Asian American Christianity at Princeton Theological Seminary. This podcast features the voices of Asian American scholars, ministry leaders, and activists in an ongoing dialogue about theology and ministry. We provide Asian American ministry leaders with a forum for dialogue, support, and critical reflection on ministry by Asian Americans, especially in Asian American ecclesial context.
Hi, everyone. It's my pleasure and privilege to host another podcast, and this time with my colleague and friend, Professor Jessica ChenFeng, who is Associate Professor of Marriage and Family Therapy at Fuller. Jessica, welcome.
So good to be chatting with you, David.
Now, how long have you been at Fuller?
So I'm starting my second academic year now as faculty. So yeah,
Wonderful.
it's been so good to be back to my other alma mater. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. Well, we're in for a treat today because we're going to talk about Jessica's clinical experience, her academic experience, especially as it pertains to Asian American families and family life. And Jessica and I have been talking about mental health and Asian American family life and church life for a while now. And we wanted to have this conversation, especially as it anticipates our January 2024 mental health conference, in which Jessica is going to be a plenary speaker along with some other fabulous speakers and workshop leaders. So, Jessica, you and I have been chatting quite a bit about migration, some of the pains, traumas even associated with the process of migration, especially for our first generation parents. I think you and I both identify as second generation Asian Americans. And the family context for us, you have young kids, I have a teenage child, is going to be different than the context that our parents parented us.
For sure.
So I'd love to hear how that migration experience, especially for our parents' generation, how that sets up perhaps some of the pains and pressure points that you see as a clinician. So I'd love for you to speak into that migration experience.
For sure. Yeah. No, thanks for that great question. And this has been such a fun conversation. Um, One of my doctoral students right now, I've been reviewing her dissertation, and one of the phrases she introduced me to is migratory loss, right? And so we know this as children of those who've migrated. And so I'm thinking a lot about anytime we're part of a family system where migration was fairly recent, the impact of migratory loss is felt in family relationships and family life. And when I think about each of us our own family stories, right? Like my own parents leaving Taiwan, my mom's family by way of Argentina, and this. If you have the gift of knowing some of those stories, one of the things I think children or adult children recognize is the layers of loss. And I'm going to use this term cutoff. Lots of cutoff that was not necessarily intentional or planned, but examples like you maybe because of when you migrated were cut off from your family in the country of origin. Contact became infrequent, or you left because of family stress or trauma. Maybe because of war you were separated from family, like you meaning like the generation that migrated. um, Psychologically you have to cut off from maybe the sadness you feel, in order to survive in a new country. So cut off both relationally, practically with tangible things like your home or what you knew to be home, but internally too. There's this emotional, psychological cutoff that people have to endure in order to establish themselves in a new place, realize like this is supposed to be home now. How do I make it that? And in order to do that, I have to leave behind, so to speak, right? What is behind me. And so I guess I've been thinking a lot about that. And if I can share by way of some clinical examples, personal examples, right? So, um, early on in my practice, when I had my private practice, and this is also like growing up in Asian American church spaces, largely East Asian church spaces. Um, when people are starting to launch second generation youth, right? Uh, who you're partnering with, you're dating, what careers you're going into, and well-meaning Asian Christian first-gen parents, including pastors, had very strong feelings about what career you're going into or who you were dating. And from my young mind, right, many of us, maybe as teenagers, growing up in the church, having a general sense of like, well, that doesn't seem like what God would support. Like, you're a pastor, but you won't allow your children to become pastors, right? Or you're this ethnicity, but you're telling your child you're not allowed to date someone because they're another ethnicity, or some other thing like related to their family or whatever. Um, in a very elementary Christian mind, is like, that doesn't seem Christian, right? And so, uh, follow that mentality down that track, and you arrive to other well-meaning pastors who say, oh, well, you need to honor your parents, right? And so there's this whole generation trying to figure out, what does it mean to honor my parents? I'm learning these things in the church about walking with Christ, following God's plan for my life. And I feel like I'm doing that, but my Christian parents are against it. Do I literally obey them? Is that what it means to honor them? And so, I guess from my perspective, I'm not describing here any sort of like right or wrong or theological answers to those hard, complex questions. But I think what many of us got from our pastoral leaders was, this is what it means and looks like to honor your parents. You should listen to them, right? Or no, what it means to honor your parents is actually to honor God. And so it's okay to deviate from what they're saying. And so, but the result is similar, which is, there's a right way to move forward. And so, XYZ is what I need to do. And uh, regardless of the internal conflict I have. And I think all of this is in the context of not necessarily addressing the relationship itself, or really understanding, well, why do my parents have such strong feelings about this? What is that about? Could it be, and this is, I'm asking this now, what about migratory loss and migration sets up first gen parents to have such strong feelings around what for them is really, value systems, survival, how they imagine they are loving and caring for their children. All of that is intertwined, and it's not as simple as like, this is what it means to follow God.
Wow, that is an awesome and rich opening meditation. I think we can spend a good 45 minutes, the rest of the podcast, unpacking all the nooks and crannies that you started to share with us. So I want to stay on topic here, and let me perhaps pick up one or two things that you threw out there, which is vocation and marriage. So let's kind of unpack some of this intergenerationally with the migratory loss theme, and then also the role of Christian faith. Um, right before we started the podcast, you and I were chatting about how understandings of goodness and success,
Mm,
as well as kind of like what is wrong or bad, these kind of moral frameworks are inflected within this migration kind of structure as well as Christian faith.
yeah.
So marrying a certain kind of person, choosing a certain career is good or successful,
Mm,
and the counter is also true. Maybe perhaps comment on how migratory loss impacts our moral assessment of spouses and vocation.
When I started my PhD program, this is like 13, 14 years ago now, I set out to study this dynamic. I was so curious. What is going on between first and second generation parents and adult children? And from the second generation perspective, there's a lot of pain, right? And like, why don't my parents support this about what I care about or who I love? Um, but I'm torn because I want to stay connected to my parents. And as I conducted interviews with first generation Chinese parents, I was really impacted. And I guess what I want to speak to, maybe it's less so values as it's related to this loss, which is it leads to intergenerational disconnect, right? And so this intergenerational disconnect shapes the loss and pain and the desires of first generation parents. So in talking, and like I remember this one conversation I had with this mom, and I could feel her sadness as she was talking about, I have a hard time communicating with my child, like language is a issue, and I want the best for him, and for me to stay connected to him, it's if he can partner with someone who we have language access altogether. I will lose him more and more if he were to marry someone whose language capacity is totally different from mine, right? So that's one thing.
Which is
First
a
gen,
very practical concern, right? So it's
for
not
sure.
like it's just the basic concern of how do I communicate with someone who will be part of my family if we don't share the same language.
Yes. And I guess it sounds, yes, very practical. But when we go to the relational component of how that affects a relationship, is here this first gen mom has lost so much in her migration experience. Maybe it's already disconnect with her own parents. She's got one child, right? And in this one child, if she loses more, what do we how do we imagine her life to be, the quality of her life, her hopes, for everything she sacrificed in this migration process is essentially, this common story of channeling it through her children, right? Her hope is success for her offspring because she doesn't get to experience that success. I've heard that from my own mom, right? I know the losses my mom has been through and the dreams and hopes she had for her own life that couldn't get fulfilled, that she hopes to see lived out in my life, right? And her children's lives. And so to me, that's a really natural, fair reality for our first gen parents. And so I think there's a piece to myself, also, second gen adult children taking the time to understand the generational impact of migratory loss, and not just from like a factual observational perspective, but from like relational disconnect and connection, like that level. When we think about belonging and connection, whether to our church communities, to our families, in my opinion, right, biased opinion as a marriage and family therapist, this creates and sets up the entire foundation of our well-being. When we don't have belonging and connection and meaningful relationship, there's not much else to build life upon. And so I think about our first gen parents, that's what they're longing for with their children. And so when you've already taken, layers of loss that they've encountered, it makes total sense, these hopes they have, right? What they imagine their children should do for a career, it's for the sake of connection and ongoing connection and financial stability, right? Um, it's for language and communication and all of these pieces. And so, um, there's this fear of like, how much more difference can I handle, and tolerate and live with? Um, So anyway, I think that's from the first gen perspective that I
Right.
was thinking of.
Well, I want to kind of forecast that the second half of our conversation, I want us to talk about our becoming parents and the
Yes.
kind of parenting challenges and parenting scripts that we experiment with as we have kids and we're trying to navigate the scripts that we've inherited, how to honor the sacrifices of our parents, but doing it with a new spirit with the next generation. So that's kind of like the back
Yes.
end of the conversation. I still want to um, process what I'm hearing from you about migratory loss. And I want to tap into your kind of clinical and subject matter expertise. Is migratory loss a kind of trauma?
Oh, I would certainly so. Yeah. Yeah. And of course, as we know, migration looks different for every Asian American family. But yeah, within that, um, I mean, at a very not big, this is hard. I don't know. It's debatable, right? What is a big T trauma? What is not, right? Our culture tends to talk about like physical violence, of course, as very real lived trauma, but there's a lot of ambiguous loss. I know Dr. Park Hearn, who will be one of our speakers too, has written about disenfranchised grief. To me, these are all forms of trauma that are emotional, that are relational, that are invisible, that most of us don't have language to discuss it, right? A first gen parent doesn't recognize the emotional relational loss that happened when she had to migrate as a early 20 something year old, maybe being the first from her family to leave the country of origin, right? There's a lot of trauma that happens just by being, I don't know, the first Asian American in your city or whatever. But in the moment, no one gives you the language to say, "Oh, that's traumatic. Like that's a big deal. You just are trying to survive." And so oftentimes I would say, I mean, for a lot of the Asian American clients and families I've worked with, to label and give the word trauma to their experience can initially be jarring, right? And this is actually connecting to the conversation we're going to continue to have, which is trauma sounds like a bad thing, right? Like who wants to have trauma as part of their family legacy or their personal identity? And so there is something about Asian Americans migrating where it's like, I went through a lot of this stuff. It was really hard, but I'm here now. I'm here to make success, help my children succeed. Let's look forward. And I don't want to think about like the wars we've been through or like financial stress. Like we're doing better. Let's keep
They're
going.
putting on a good face. Like,
Yes. Yes. And it's for survival's sake.
mhm.
And what happens psychologically, though, is even in parenting, right, there's now a desire to like not feel or think the bad things, so to speak, right? This is in quotations. Um, so, like, let's not cry or be too sad. Let's, eh, sometimes I think Asian mentality and work ethic is there's sort of this overlap with some of the what do you call it, like Western individualistic idea of like pulling yourself up by the bootstraps idea, right? Like where, let's just suck it up and go, right? And there's a lot of detriment to us relationally. And I guess what I'll say is it sets up within our own minds less of a tolerance for complexity and for both and, right? So instead of, I'm imagining a first gen parent to their child, right? Um, you know, you you're going through a hard time, you're sad about something at school, you didn't pass an exam, right? There is the view of like, oh my gosh, you're all bad, and the shaming route, right? You're terrible, you didn't study hard enough, so on and so forth, right? And then, though, in order to cope with that shame and feeling bad, you propel yourself into this opposite, which is I'm going to work my butt off, study nonstop, this perfectionistic, all out attitude in order to compensate, right? And so, um, parenting tactics come through along those lines oftentimes, right? And yeah, it looks like you have something to say.
Yeah, no, this is a really rich concept. The low tolerance for complexity. Say more about why 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 do people have a low tolerance for I suppose it's because we have a high tolerance for simplicity, or we prefer things that are black and white
Sure.
or very morally clear.
Yes, yes. Oh my gosh, this is a whole thing. There's so much about this I'm still curious about myself. And I think this shows up too in some of our like current political and religious spaces in this day and age. But in specific relationship to maybe migration, right? Because of experiences of loss and trauma, and you're trying to survive, our brain's inherent desire is for things to be clear, right? If there's so much background noise, so what trauma does to our brain is essentially it's like having all these lights on, but you're trying to go to sleep while there are all these lights on, right? And you have to just like avoid it. You're like trying not to look at it, or you're like covering your eyes just to, do whatever it is you need to do. That's not like the best analogy, but that's what I just thought of, right? But there's some sort of like background distraction. Um, in order to keep moving forward, I need my road to be as simple and clear as can be.
It's a coping mechanism.
It is. So, church systems that have clear theology, that have this black and white, like this is what it means to honor your parents. You do this, you don't do this. This is what it means to honor God. Like that's helpful. That's helpful for um, families who have migrated, and it gives them clarity. It feels safe, right? And the challenge also comes, which is why I think we continue to see generations of wrestling with faith identity. When the rubber hits the road and you are encountering life in all of its complexity, this very black and white theology we grew up with is not translating to my parenting context now, or like my work, my career, the loss I face now in life. Like I'm not sure how to make sense of God in it, right? So yeah, if that sort of answers the question you posed.
Oh, it totally does. It totally does. I think I'm going to continue to reflect upon this notion of low tolerance for complexity. Um, we can begin pivoting to how this first generation suffering of migratory loss and perhaps even trauma, how that begins to impact the relationship of the second generation, folks like you and me,
Yeah.
and the third generation. Um, you know that I'm going through a lot as a parent.
Yeah.
I think parenting a teen is maybe the hardest thing I've ever
Oh
encountered.
my goodness.
I myself am forced to try and experiment with new models. Like the things that I saw from my parents, I've exhausted that playbook, and it doesn't really work that well for my particular situation.
Yeah.
And so the parenting I received was very much born of everything you've described in these first, 30 minutes.
Mm.
And so part of the challenge and part of what I want to do through the programming of the center, through the mental health conference, through various workshops is for other parents, other Asian American Christians to share their sort of innovations, their sort of
Mm.
creative spirit,
Yeah.
their sort of complexities, to kind of riff off of what you're saying, and how they are navigating honoring their parents with loving their kids in ways that make sense for their kids, right?
Yeah.
So I think about this notion of a faith of our own. Well,
Mm,
when English ministries were kind of taking off in the 90s, there's a lot of friction with first generation congregations. But part of the desire was for the second gen to have a faith of their own.
mm,
And I think in the next 10 to 20 and more years, the next generation will also want to have a faith of their own. And I strongly believe that what happens in the Asian American church setting is oftentimes mirrored in the Asian American family setting. There's
mm.
a deep
Yeah.
connection between Asian American family life and Asian American church life.
Mm,
So feel free to share from your clinical experience, your own experience as a parent of young children, but how have you had to play jazz, innovate
yes,
with
yes,
new models and new scripts for parenting?
yeah.
So let's just comment on the first piece. I don't know how to say it, but like, is it often the case that we can simply take what worked in the past and simply apply it to the present?
Oh,
That was my default strategy.
yeah.
I struggled with it. Is my struggle fairly common or uncommon?
Mm, I think it's really common, David. And I think there's this I'm with you. I think parenting is one of the hardest things because at least the way I'm through my lens, it's like I'm always holding up a mirror. There's always a mirror of myself, at least with young children. I'm like, oh my gosh, like they're doing exactly what I do, or that tactic definitely did not work out, and it's in my face now, right? Um, and there's a piece of, I don't know about for you, but I see my mother in myself,
Mm,
right? And
yes,
all of her
yes,
her beauty, her limitations, like,
yep,
and I joke about this with childhood friends who are we're all parents now. It's like we're becoming our mothers, and there we joke about it, and some of it though I think is a gift. Like to me, when I think about not just my mother but my aunties, like there's there's this Taiwanese American resilience I get to have, right, in my mothering. And I see it show up in our very feisty, sassy girl, right? 2.5-year-old girl. I will say there's a difference. So if I can show it by example of parenting our daughter Liberty. Growing up, I was the older of two daughters. My mother, who really had wanted to become a physician. She came from a long line of physicians in her family, but because of the age she was when she migrated, her academic journey was just sort of cut in ways that were hard. So she couldn't pursue that. And so here I am, this older daughter who's like very obedient, did all the right things, right? And there's a term you might know this, like guai guai, right? I'm saying it from a like with the Taiwanese accent. Um, it was important for me to be guai guai, right,
hmm
as the first daughter, and I was, and I am in general, right? Like, and as I see, first gen parents interact with our children, that is still a very strong value, right?
hmm
And I think back to Asian American church systems, um, gendered expectations around Asian girls. Being guai guai, which is like good, obedient, right? All of these things was a very important trait to have. There's really no question about it. It is just like how you're supposed to be. Now, when I raise my daughter, especially, I'm like, is that an important value to me? Not in and of itself. It depends on the context, right? And so when my daughter pushes back, which she does every day, multiple times a day, right, it challenges me and I get frustrated, but I'm aware of her context now. Like for my mother, for me to be guai guai, it was a matter of survival. And I'll say, like, racially too. For me to be a submissive, obedient Asian young girl helped me to make it through my educational system, to survive in white spaces, right? To be respected in the church, right? That was the value that was respected in women. But for my daughter now, I'm raising her in a very different context. If she is only guai guai, she will be stepped on. She will not have a voice, right? And so, but it takes in me, a parent, to critically examine the values of my mom's context, not to look at it judgmentally and say, oh, like, mom is so one sided. No, that was important for that generation to parent in that way because it made sense and it was about survival. And it's how my mom was resilient and taught me to be resilient in the only context that she knew. But I have a different set of experiences growing up biculturally and experiencing racism differently and sexism differently than my mother. And so, with that knowledge, um, and seeing gender differently than my mother did, right? That we want to raise our daughter to not to be guai guai in some situations, but to have a very vibrant, pushback kind of personality. And so I don't know if that kind of highlights some of the things we're sort of wrestling around.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. What's emerging from that particular case, which is fantastic, is being guai guai between you and your mother served a particular utility and it made sense. So
Mhm.
you're not denigrating it per se,
Yep. Yeah.
but for you and your daughter, being guai guai may make sense in some cases, but may not in other cases. What
Mhm.
you've done there is you've complicated the virtue of being guai guai.
Yeah.
It's not a one size fits all in all places in all times.
Yeah.
It takes some wisdom to discern its correct application, so to speak.
Yeah. For sure. And I guess I think thank you for reflecting that to me, because it helps me to sort of think more about the difference in my mind is understanding our shifting context, right?
Yeah.
Understanding what is the context of our parents, speaking of our first gen parents, migration world, what it looked like to make a life for their family. Parents, I really believe parents always try to do their best, right, for their families, their loved ones, their children. And so it always makes sense. People's behaviors usually make sense, right? By and large, when we think about the context you and I are raising our kids in, we're also in different contexts. We might be similar generationally, but where you live in the East Coast, where I live here in Southern California, like, all those variables shape our parenting. And I guess my encouragement is for us to think and receive both and ways of being, right? Which is, what about my parents' way of parenting has given me resilience? How do I make sense of it? What is their legacy that I get to have? And what is it that I get to add to that, right? And how do I think about the differences in my theological understanding, my relationship to God and to myself, which I hope maybe have the luxury and time to think about with friends and my church community, that then shifts my parenting, right? I don't know if many of our parents had the luxury of time, or even, I mean, here you and I, like, we're doctorally trained, like, we
Yep.
get to think about this. Like, this is
Yep.
fun, right? It's
Yep.
also work.
Yep.
Most first gen parents didn't have that,
Correct.
right? They're literally just trying to pay bills and survive and get food on the
To do
table.
laundry and taxes, to quote everything everywhere all at once.
Yes. Yeah, exactly, right? And so with the things we might have access to now, it allows for more complexity of thought. It allows us to hold, like, there's both pain and trauma and grief in my family line, and there is this beauty and resilience and things I'm clueless about that I'm figuring out for my children.
So I know that therapy is often done individually. Sometimes there is group therapy where you might bring in like a parent and a child. I'm thinking about models of ministry, but also in the church. that may cross 3 generations.
Mhm.
I don't know if I'm trying to think about actual churches that have 3 generations all
Yeah.
in one place and the challenges therein. I'm
Mhm.
also just thinking about intergenerational family life under one roof.
Mm.
More and more, folks like yourself, we have kids, but then our parents come to live with us, especially as um, our parents struggle with health issues or perhaps one of them passes.
Yeah.
Um, I can imagine, let's just take the family under one roof sort of scenario. That could be really pressure filled. Like sometimes just Thanksgiving or Christmas with the parents, that's enough. Can
Yeah.
you imagine like living extended periods with in-laws or parents?
Yeah.
I'm just curious whether from your friendship network, your church network, or your clinical experience, like what are marks of success? Like
Mhm.
how do
Yeah.
intergenerational families coexist peacefully, even harmoniously under one roof? And
Yeah.
kind of analogously in the church context, what would it take
Mhm.
for an intergenerational church to model the unity of the body of Christ? Because I'm thinking here's where I'm kind of projecting.
Yeah.
More and more first gen churches are graying,
Mhm.
and they won't have enough membership or tithing to
Mhm.
support either the rent or the salary of the pastor, which means the second gen will be needed. And in some cases, they want the second gen if it's a kinship network, like they want to see their kids and then they want to see their grandkids. So the notion of these bifurcated or siloed generational ministries, I don't know. I don't know how locked that is,
Yeah.
locked in that is. It may evolve where there are incentive structures for the first gen and the second gen to kind of pool resources.
Yeah.
I imagine that may become more and more necessary, especially as the migration flows from Asia shift and diminish, and that they don't automatically populate the overseas born congregations. Anyways, that's a mouthful, but maybe begin with intergenerational family life. Like, what do
Yeah.
you think are some key strategies to make that work?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh my gosh. Isn't that like the $1,000,000 question these days,
Especially
right?
as your parents and my parents get older, this is no longer a theoretical issue. This is a practical issue.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm thinking of both like micro examples but larger picture ideas. Maybe I'll just start with some large picture thoughts, which is, I've worked with some family systems, even church intergenerational dynamics, where I just want to acknowledge it's truly painful, right? Like there's a lot of pain navigating generational dynamics for whatever reason, cultural differences, value differences, all kinds of things. Like these days, religious and political differences are really real.
And past words that were spoken in anger, right? Like
Yes.
the wounds we have actually effected upon each other,
Yeah.
actual conflicts between members and family members, right? So I think in not having properly confessed and forgiven each other because of those past wounds and hurts.
Yeah. Yes. Most definitely. Um, you know, I as I share this, I have not worked through, all of us trained as clinicians within the US, we still have Western colonized minds, even in how we were trained.
Hmm.
And there's a lot I've been doing to try to look at, examine that and see. So as I share these things, I invite viewers to consider, does it apply to your context? Every family's level of identifying with uh, communal collectivist ideas, autonomous individualistic one, it's different, it varies. So what I will say as a second gen person, and I don't know if this seems fair, as our parents age, I think a lot of relational responsibility falls on our generation.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think there's a piece of like maybe when you're a little younger, your parents' minds are there. maybe there's more of an expectation, like I wish my parents would do XYZ or say this to me or apologize for that. I think there comes a time when that might be less realistic, right? And there's an element, and we do hear about, like, on, sometimes on people's deathbeds, like they apologize to their children. I mean, those are ideal and wonderful stories. But also, like, depending on a parent's condition, if their brain is changing and they don't have the capacity to, what does it mean to have a meaningful connection to parents? I say meaningful because it looks different for everyone. Meaningful does not necessarily mean you can have active live conversation with parents and for their not, like, it's not tension filled. For some people, that's the reality. No matter when and how they talk to their parents, it ends up stressful. It ends up in a fight, right? So when I say meaningful, I'm going to go back to this honoring our parents. Like, what does it mean, right? I'm no theologian here, but I was looking into the word honor and how the Bible means it to be. And one of the possible definitions is like to value and to revere. Right? Thinking about any other context where I value something, I need to know, like, here, I have my Ember cup. Okay. I love this thing. I really value this because I know how it functions, right? It's made of a certain, material. It keeps my coffee warm long past the hour after I'm dealing with the kids and get them out to school, and it's still keeping my coffee warm. So I know its traits, its attributes, its limitations. I can't soak it in water. I can't, it'll burn the coffee if there's just a little bit left. I give this silly example because I think about, what does it mean to value my parents? It means to know them for who they are, not some imagination of who I wish they could be, what I need them to do, but who they are today, right now, with all of their strengths and their limitations. The reality of, is it reasonable for me to expect XYZ from them or not? And as an adult child, how do I live with this peacefully within myself? Right. So to me, that's sort of like the inner work that we can do now that we are, adults, and we are reflecting on some of these generational dynamics. Um, I don't think that necessarily leads to relational peace, but I think sometimes this internal awareness and peace can come first, right? Even as external things are shifting. And yeah, it's sometimes hard to use personal examples with your family, because they still are around and you want to honor them, right? But I'll say, just from my own experience, there's a lot of freedom for me, like the sort of angst I had as an adult child, to parents, was relieved when I started to see my parents for who they are. And I remember this happened, sometime within the last decade, when we were raising our first child, and realizing, like, when will my child start to really get to know me as a parent for who I am, not just an extension of them, right?
That's
And
good.
and our son, who's 6 now, cutest thing. Recently he said to me, "Mama, when are you going to tell me your whole life story?" I'm like, wow. Like, he has this idea of me as a separate person from him. I don't think I had that sensitivity toward my own parent till I was much later in life. And
Yes.
so, all of it to say, I think our connectedness to our parents has a lot to do with our being able to see ourselves and our parents as separate individual people that God loves. Yeah.
I have a question, and I also want to think about practical strategies for intergenerational church life. So we kind of discussed the family life piece, and then I want to see what kind of strategies we might have for intergenerational church life. But
Right.
one thought that emerged that I'm taking away from what you've just shared is when there's trauma or pain or suffering emotionally attached to an early phase of our relationship with our parents, whether the adolescent years, the young adult, maybe we married someone that they disapproved. That
Mm,
was really traumatic. Maybe we took a career path that they disapproved. That was really traumatic. Maybe our academic years and as teens were really not a healthy relationship. I wonder how that gets locked
mhm,
in time.
yeah,
So Shirley Lung at the April AAT
mhm,
conference, she mentioned something called the time capsule effect for migrants, how
mhm,
our emotional and sort of memory of our homeland is pretty much frozen in time based on the time period we'd
mhm.
left. So
Yeah,
if we left Taiwan in the 70s or Korea, let's say Korea in the 70s under the dictatorship, we're going to have a certain association with Korea under dictatorship in the 70s. But if we left in the late 90s during its economic boom, then our attachment or association of the homeland will be from the 90s, right? And that's the image of Korea that we have with us today. I wonder, so it's a little bit different with our relationship with our parents, but I wonder if there's something that carries through, which is how unresolved pain
mm,
sort of over determines the relationship. And that's
yes.
what
Oh,
sticks
for
out,
sure.
which then makes it very difficult to reimagine the relationship today. Because that's what
Yes.
one of the strategies you mentioned was we need to kind of let go to
Mhm.
reimagine
Yeah.
a new kind of relating to our parents as needing our help
Mhm.
because we are now in a place to help them. Man,
Yeah.
that's really hard if you're kind of
Yes.
stuck frozen in time, right?
Yeah. Oh, such a great question. And what I want to highlight is um I don't mean for it to sound so simple, right? Like, okay, let go of this whatever and reimagine your parents and see them for all their resilience and strength. No, because actually this might help people feel less shame. Let's say we're in a place where we really resent our parents and we're really upset still about something that has happened or season that was really difficult. There are true neurological reasons why that's the case, right? Um, Oversimplifying it here, but basically, let's say you get attacked by a dog when you're a little child, right?
Yep.
And what is happening in the context of trauma, how it gets encoded in our brains, is that there's this neuron that we call it potentiation. It gets potentiated in one of your amygdala. That is to help you survive. So in the future, if you see a big dog again, your brain's going to say, get out of there. It's scary. It's going to bite you. It's meant to help your brain keep your body alive, right? Um, Now, thankfully, we have all these interventions to help us depotentiate those neurons. But the same thing happens emotionally, right? If you're in an emotional situation and you remember your parent was berating you, yelling at you for something you did or something they were upset about, that literally is like seared on your mind. Those neurons got potentiated in your brain. The way that our brain works is that that potentiation stays that way unless we intentionally depotentiate those neurons through treatment and various interventions. And this is a specific situation where I always say get individual therapy for that kind of traumatic like embeddedness, right? Because the treatment options we have today are amazing. You can resolve those kinds of, deeply embedded traumatic responses to help you move on with life. Right? It's true no matter how hard we try sometimes, your brain is has been taught and it's encoded to tell you, oh, if you bring up this sort of conversation with your dad, inevitably this is going to happen because it did, right? And it was scary. So I just wanted to validate people who are recognizing these responses, trauma responses, a lot of high emotional activation in their relationship with their parents. There's a good amount of clinical work around trauma that can be so helpful to address that so that you can move forward toward building maybe something different, right? Yeah.
Wow. I loved learning about potentiation and depotentiation. That's super helpful. And I love the layering in of the neuroscience. You and I have spoken before. I love learning about the neuroscience behind the therapeutic. Maybe we can close on just this pivot to the church and how immigrant church life oftentimes carries both the joys as well as the pains associated with immigrant family life, and how this is both an opportunity but sometimes a barrier. And I just reference the challenges for different generations within church settings to understand. I mean, there's enough tensions within a generation
Yeah.
to cooperate, to do shared gospel labor. But then you layer in cultural, linguistic, kind of value differentiation across generations, and we've just compounded it.
Yeah.
Um, and so maybe we can just begin with this theme of migratory loss and trauma. I'm thinking sometimes second gen faith leaders have difficulty with first gen faith leaders because it conjures up old family wounds. Like how much of that is unresolved with even within the church context, right? So it's kind of like if we have this ongoing in our families,
Mhm.
and churches often mirror or reflect a lot of those family dynamics. And if we haven't addressed, if we haven't depotentiated some
Yeah.
of this trauma, we are carrying those wounds into these session meetings, into these budget meetings, into these hiring conversations where the anger comes out and we kind of hurt people sort of scenario. I
Yeah.
mean, I'd love just to hear your reflections on this.
Yeah, yeah. I might go somewhere controversial, which is
That's fine.
I think it's hard to talk about, especially Asian American church leadership, generational struggles, conflicts, without talking about patriarchy. Because largely our pastors are still Asian American men,
Correct.
right? And I say this like we're not doing a binary thing here, right? Having worked with men and women clinically, professionally, Asian Americans, that's what I mean. Um, there's a lot that has happened and is happening with Asian American male identity, right? We think about first gen dads, now grandfathers, who migrated and the expectations put at that point in time on sons, right? And sort of the internalized stress, the need to provide for family, the models of leadership that were given to them. Maybe there were dictators, maybe there were authoritarian type parents they had. Those are the models, and I don't mean to oversimplify it, but I would say that's fairly common generationally, right? And so those models come, and it's what people know in terms of leading a church, right? So I know it sounds simple, but something like even going through leadership training or communication training, generational awareness, like all of that feeds into church tension and generational stress, right? Which is one generation's way of, this first gen male pastor's way of communication is not flying with this second gen person who's trained in communication skills, right? And active listening. Like what first gen Asian male values active listening? Like I know there are some, but like it's not what was modeled, right? So um I guess I wanted to highlight that because I think there are differences when you're then having women at the table and you're adding different skill sets and training sets and personalities to the mix. I think the larger dominant culture also harms Asian American men, right, in many ways, racially, in terms of their gender identity, and that pressure, um, that being invisible, being dismissed, not valued, not seen as a leader, that gets channeled unconsciously through church dynamics. And
Hmm.
so I just want to say, like, I think those are important things to be aware of as we consider when we talk about intergenerational pastoral dynamics. We're largely talking about men. And so I just think that's something to put on the table. I know it goes beyond what we were initially going to talk about.
Do you
Everything.
think do you think if women were more explicitly part of that conversation, that that would heighten the tension between generations or improve the relationships between the generations?
I think it depends. I think it depends on the level of patriarchy that's embedded within a church culture, right? If you have, I mean, you think of any like minoritized group that is trying to be part of the conversation, and oftentimes, if they have the ability to do so, it's experienced as pushing back or being defiant, right? um, how well does that sit with the
Hmm.
dominant person or community? It doesn't sit well. It causes more tension, right? But if you're at a place where, let's say, theologically, a church is egalitarian and it ordains women, and there are more women at the table, and men are doing the hard work of working through their own internalized patriarchal ideas, right? That all of us were raised within. Then it's, I would say it's much harder work. It's a different kind of work, but you have different types of voices to help figure things out and offer perspective. And um yeah, so I feel like I'm our family, I feel blessed to be part of a church community where we're witnessing that more and more. Female pastors working alongside male pastors, and there's just sort of like this the sort of, I don't know if this is better. There's another way to say this, but like the sort of masculinity that's represented in our male pastors feels very different from me than other models I've seen. Right. So yeah.
I want to wrap things up because we've kind of hit our hour, and I feel like we're planting the seeds for a future conversation about the role of gender and intergenerational dynamics within the church. Here's a closing comment, and I do invite any thoughts that this provokes. So I worked in the corporate world for almost 9 years in book publishing, and I had many female bosses, and I've also had male bosses,
Mhm.
supervisors. There's a very different dynamic
Mhm.
between male leadership and female leadership.
Yeah.
All of my thoughts and feelings are just purely anecdotal,
Yeah.
but I'll say this: I liked my female bosses better.
Okay.
So this is my amateur, I don't know, psychologist hat, and so I'm curious about the studies around women leadership and male leadership. But uh, at risk of stereotype, I felt like my female supervisors were better communicators.
Mhm.
They also were very attentive to the relational dynamics in the room and a lot of what was implicit. Like
Mhm.
their radars were just highly attuned to that. And I was just oblivious to it. So they would kind of fill me in on what they saw and heard that I had zero clue on.
Mhm.
Um, and I also noticed that perhaps, again, at the risk of sticking my foot in my mouth, at the risk of some of their intra women conflicts,
Mhm.
I did not have that if I was not a woman. So
Mhm.
there was a kind of safety that they had with someone of the opposite
Mm.
sex that
Sure.
there might have been competition with other women. And also, I think about men too, that men may have certain forms of competition which may not exist when there's a woman in the room.
For sure.
So all of this begins to complicate how mixing things up could be a boon or it could be a hindrance. But I am curious if you have any immediate responses
Oh,
to what I've
yeah.
shared.
No, I love this conversation. Just a side note, one of the advanced clinical courses I teach is on gender and power in
Wow.
couples work, right? So, I mean, all of this is so loaded with wonderful stuff. I think what's important, I want to say this, I'm thinking about, all the genders that are listening in, right?
Yeah.
For men, you might hear this and think, oh, we're pitting, maleness against femaleness. To me, this is a matter of common socialization of genders and context, right? From the way that we raise young girls, teaching girls to be aware of how their friends are feeling, right? This and that, and sort of the emotional stuntedness of boys. Don't, I'm oversimplifying, but don't cry, be a man, like. And so there are certain emotions that are allowed to be felt and experienced, and others that are less so, right? The permission given to women is a bit more vast. And so that's just one small example, but you extrapolate that to a whole lifetime of social relational training, of development, of being in the workplace. And I do think that, yes, female bosses or colleagues could present a certain way. I also want to say women, because I worked in healthcare for a number of years with physicians, women can also internalize patriarchy by wanting to one up each other because the systems we're all a part of are still patriarchal, right? The dynamic is still to, like, even if they're relational, attuned, aware, to get to the top, you still have to be masculine in order to do so. Those rules don't change. And so, the infighting, like, I think that's all part of systemic related issues. So those are just some initial thoughts.
I
Yeah.
need to take your gender and power seminar. That sounds like an
Yeah.
incredible topic, a class to discuss. Jessica, you've been so generous with your insights and just the stories you've told. I've learned so much from our conversation today, and I just want to thank you for having this podcast conversation with me.
Such a delight, David. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Dialogues podcast. The Center for Asian American Christianity invites you to join our ongoing conversation on Asian American identity, faith, theology, and ministry through the Dialogues magazine, the Dialogues in Asian American Theology, and Ministry Public Gatherings, the annual Mental Health Conference, and the annual Asian American Theology Conference. You can find more information and sign up for our newsletter at caac.ptsem.edu.